Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. Outpost Meridian 9 floated in the darkness between star systems like a metal soap bubble that someone had forgotten to pop. It wasn't the most glamorous posting in the Galactic Union, and it certainly wasn't the most exciting, but it had something that the bustling trade stations and military outposts lacked: functional coffee machines and a merciful absence of daily emergencies that required actual thinking. Ben stood in Recreation Bay 3, tossing a wrench up and catching it with the kind of casual disregard for safety protocols that comes from 6 months of soul-crushing boredom. The wrench spun end over end, glinting under the fluorescent lights, and he caught it without looking, because apparently his life had become so predictable that his subconscious could handle basic hand-eye coordination, while his conscious mind contemplated the heat death of the universe. Maintenance specialist. That's what his job title said. What it really meant was person who fixes things that break because other people can't read instruction manuals. He'd left Earth dreaming of adventure, of first contact scenarios, of defending humanity's honor in the cosmic arena. Instead, he spent his days recalibrating atmospheric processors and explaining to visiting delegates that, no, the water dispenser was not sentient, it was just broken. The wrench went up again, came down, up, down. You know, he said to absolutely nobody, because talking to yourself was either the first sign of madness or the last defense against it. I used to have ambitions, goals. I was going to be somebody. The wrench answered by continuing to obey the laws of physics, which was more reliability than he'd gotten from most of his relationships. That's when he heard it. A soft, chittering sound, like wind chimes made of curiosity and mischief. Ben turned, and his heart did that thing where it tries to escape through his ribcage, because standing in the doorway were 3 Runaki cubs, and if there was one species in the known galaxy that you absolutely, positively, under no circumstances wanted to accidentally offend, it was the Runaki. The cubs stared at him with eyes the size of dinner plates, their fur rippling through shades of deep violet and silver. They looked like someone had taken house cats, scaled them up to the size of small dogs, given them 4 arms instead of 4 legs, and then dipped them in stardust and bad decisions. Their ear equivalents, delicate fronds that sprouted from the sides of their heads, quivered with interest. "Oh," Ben said intelligently. "Hi." The largest of the 3, Mikto, if Ben remembered correctly from the delegation briefings he definitely hadn't slept through, tilted his head at an angle that would have snapped a human neck. His front 2 arms were tucked against his chest, while his rear 2 arms supported his weight, giving him the appearance of a very judgmental sphinx. "Hey there, little guy," Ben said, lowering the wrench slowly, because sudden movements around Runaki cubs were how diplomatic incidents started. "Shouldn't you be with your pod, pack, murder?" The cubs chittered among themselves, and Ben was pretty sure they were laughing at him, which was fair because he was absolutely butchering Runaki social terminology. Rala, the smallest, crept forward with the confidence of someone who had never met a consequence she couldn't cute her way out of. Her fronds were doing this flutter thing that Ben's cultural sensitivity training had mentioned meant either excitement or impending violence, and he really hoped it was the former. Tisk, the middle child in terms of size but apparently the leader in terms of chaos energy, made a sound like a question mark had achieved sentience and learned to vocalize. Ben looked at the wrench in his hand. He looked at the cubs. He looked at the wrench again. This was a bad idea. He knew this was a bad idea. Every functioning neuron in his brain was screaming that this was a catastrophically bad idea. He threw the wrench, It clattered against the far wall of the recreation bay with a metallic clang that echoed in the sudden silence. The cubs' fronds went completely still, their eyes tracking the wrench's trajectory with the focus of tiny, furry mathematicians calculating ballistic trajectories. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then Mikto moved, and Ben understood why the Runaki were considered such effective soldiers. The cub crossed the 20-meter distance to the wrench in a blur of violet fur and determined purpose, all forearms pumping in a gait that looked like it was defying at least 2 laws of motion. He snatched up the wrench, reversed direction without slowing down, and returned to drop it at Ben's feet with a triumphant chitter that roughly translated to, "I have conquered your metal stick. Acknowledge my glory." "Oh no," Ben said, because he recognized that look. He'd seen it on every dog, cat, and questionably domesticated raccoon he'd ever met. It was the look that said, "We're doing this again, and I will accept no refusal." Rala and Tisk were already vibrating with anticipation, their fronds standing straight up in what Ben's training had definitely mentioned was extreme excitement, possibly also the precursor to spontaneous combustion. The documentation had been unclear. "Okay," Ben said, picking up the wrench. "One more time. Just one more time, and then you guys need to get back to your mom before I end up explaining to Commander Greml why her cubs learned human games instead of, I don't know, whatever it is Runaki cubs are supposed to learn. Quantum mechanics? Advanced philosophy? The true meaning of honor?" He threw the wrench again, harder this time. This was a mistake, because now all 3 cubs launched themselves after it like furry missiles with a vendetta against stationary objects. They collided mid-leap, became a tangled ball of limbs and indignant chittering, hit the ground rolling, separated into individual cubs again, through what appeared to be pure spite, and continued their pursuit without missing a beat. Tisk reached the wrench first this time, grabbing it with both front arms and holding it aloft like it was the Galactic Championship trophy. Mikto attempted a tackle that would have made professional athletes weep with envy. Rala went for the strategic approach and simply climbed on top of both of them. The resulting wrestling match was the most entertainment Ben had experienced in 6 months, and he was man enough to admit that his standards had dropped significantly since leaving Earth. Okay, break it up," he said, approaching the furry pile of competitive determination. "It's not a team sport. Well, actually, I guess it could be a team sport. But then you'd need rules and referees and probably insurance." Rala emerged victorious, the wrench clutched in her front arms while her rear arms propelled her toward Ben at a speed that violated several station safety regulations. She skidded to a stop, dropped the wrench, and looked up at him with eyes that absolutely knew they'd just discovered the best thing ever. Ben picked up the wrench again, his brain finally catching up with his actions and beginning the lengthy process of explaining to him exactly how badly he'd messed up. Runaki cubs weren't just cute. They were the genetic offspring of Commander Greml, who led the Runaki delegation and who had personally negotiated 3 peace treaties, ended 2 wars, and once stared down a Ulmara battle fleet until they apologized for existing in her general vicinity. The Runaki took parenting with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for religious ceremonies and orbital mechanics. Their cubs were considered sacred, their development carefully monitored, their education a matter of cultural pride. And Ben had just taught them fetch, with a wrench, in an unsupervised recreation bay. "You know what?" he said to the cubs, who were now sitting in a perfect row like the world's most attentive and furry students. "Maybe we should keep this between us? Like a secret? Do you guys understand secrets?" Mikto chittered something that sounded affirmative, but was probably actually the Runaki equivalent of, "We're definitely telling everyone." Ben threw the wrench again anyway, because at this point he was committed to the bit, and also because watching the cubs scramble after it with such pure, unfiltered joy was probably the highlight of his entire posting. 20 minutes later, after Ben had introduced the cubs to the concept of tennis balls, which he'd smuggled aboard in direct violation of the no unnecessary recreational equipment policy, because sometimes a man needed to bounce a ball against a wall while contemplating his life choices. The cubs finally tired themselves out enough to leave. They departed the recreation bay in a neat single-file line, Mikto in the lead with the tennis ball clutched like treasure, Rala and Tisk following with the kind of satisfied exhaustion that came from a game well played. Ben watched them go, then looked at the remaining tennis ball in his hand. "This is fine," he told himself, with the confidence of a man standing in a burning building and insisting the fire added character. "They're just cubs. They'll forget about this by tomorrow. Runaki have short attention spans, right? That's definitely a thing I remember from the briefings." It was not a thing from the briefings. Runaki had perfect recall and the kind of long-term memory that made elephants look forgetful. But Ben didn't know that yet, and ignorance, as they say, is bliss. At least until tomorrow, when the first helmet went missing. Ben woke up the next morning to the sound of Terrence making breakfast, which was generous terminology for rehydrating protein cubes in hot water until they achieved the consistency of regret. "You look terrible," Terrence observed, with the casual cruelty of someone who'd shared quarters with Ben for 6 months and had long since abandoned social niceties. "Bad dreams about atmospheric processors again?" "I taught Commander Grethmal's cubs fetch yesterday," Ben said into his pillow. There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of protein cubes dissolving into their final edible form. "You what?" "Fetch. With a tennis ball. They loved it. It was adorable. I'm going to die." Terrence laughed, which was the appropriate response to someone else's impending diplomatic execution. "Relax. Cubs play games. It's normal. You're being paranoid." Ben wanted to believe him. He really did. He got dressed, consumed his protein cube breakfast with the enthusiasm of someone eating evidence, and headed to his shift in the maintenance bay with the hope that yesterday had been a one-time occurrence, and the cubs had moved on to other interests, like quantum mechanics or whatever it was that Runaki cubs did for fun. He made it exactly 90 minutes into his shift before reality came knocking. The knocking was literal. 3 soft taps on the maintenance bay door, followed by chittering that Ben now recognized the way a prey animal recognizes the sound of approaching predators. He opened the door. All 3 cubs stood there, and Mikto was holding something in his front arms that made Ben's blood pressure spike into the concerning medical event range. It was a helmet. Specifically, a navigation helmet from the docking bay, complete with integrated heads-up display, communication array, and the kind of price tag that made maintenance specialists weep. "No," Ben said. No, absolutely not. Where did you get that?" Mikto chittered proudly and dropped the helmet at Ben's feet, then sat back on his haunches with an expression of pure expectation. He wanted Ben to throw it. "I can't throw this," Ben hissed, looking around to make sure nobody was watching. "This is equipment. Expensive. Equipment. Equipment that someone is definitely going to miss." Rala made a sound like disappointment achieving consciousness and learning to judge people. "Don't give me that look," Ben said, picking up the helmet with shaking hands. "I'm returning this, right now, to the docking bay, where it belongs." The cub's fronds drooped with such profound sadness that Ben felt like he'd just kicked a basket of puppies off a cliff. "Tomorrow," he heard himself say. because apparently his self-preservation instinct had filed for early retirement. "I'll play with you tomorrow, in the recreation bay, with appropriate toys, not helmets." The cubs perked up immediately, chittered their goodbyes, and scampered off with the coordination of a special operations team that had achieved their mission objective. Ben clutched the helmet and tried to remember if the station had a temple, because he needed to start praying to whatever deity protected idiots from themselves. Returning the helmet proved harder than anticipated, mainly because the docking bay supervisor, a human named Odette, who served as station commander and terrified everyone equally, was conducting an inventory check when Ben arrived. "Lost something?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made grown adults confess to crimes they hadn't committed. "Found something," Ben corrected, holding up the helmet. "In the, maintenance corridor. Must have been misplaced." Odette's eyes narrowed, but she accepted the helmet with a nod. Careless. Someone's getting docked pay for this. Ben escaped before she could ask follow-up questions, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to file a complaint with management. One helmet returned. Crisis averted. Everything was fine. Everything was not fine. The next day, the cubs appeared again, this time with Tisk in the lead. And Tisk was carrying an engineering helmet from the reactor observation deck, which was located in a restricted section that required 3 separate security clearances to access. "How?" Ben said flatly, staring at the helmet like it was a live grenade. "How did you even get into that section?" Tisk chittered something that probably translated to, "We're very talented," and dropped the helmet expectantly. Ben returned that helmet too, inventing an increasingly elaborate story about finding it in the ventilation system, which the engineering supervisor believed because apparently nobody questioned why random equipment was migrating around the station. On the 3rd day, Mikto arrived carrying Commander Greml's personal command helmet, the one with her family crest etched into the metal, the one she wore during formal ceremonies, the one that was supposed to be in her private quarters behind a locked door. Ben actually sat down on the floor when he saw it, because his legs had decided they were done supporting someone who made such catastrophically poor life choices. "You stole from your own mother," he said, looking at Mikto with a mixture of horror and reluctant admiration. "You committed theft against the commander of the Runaki delegation. For fetch." Mikto's expression suggested this was a completely reasonable exchange rate. That's when Tina found him, sitting on the floor of Corridor 8B, holding Commander Greml's helmet, while 3 alien cubs sat around him like furry accomplices, waiting for their next heist assignment. Tina was station security, which meant she noticed everything, forgot nothing, and had the kind of professional paranoia that made her excellent at her job and exhausting to play poker with. "Ben?" she said slowly, her hand drifting toward her datapad. "Why are you holding the commander's helmet?" "Would you believe I found it?" "No." "Would you believe the cubs gave it to me?" "That's somehow worse. Explain." Ben explained, watching Tina's expression cycle through disbelief, amusement, horror, and finally settling on the kind of exhausted acceptance that came from dealing with human crew members for too long. "You taught Runaki cubs fetch," she said, like saying it out loud might change the reality. "In my defense, they're very cute, and I was very bored. You're aware that 3 helmets have gone missing in the last 3 days?" "I'm becoming increasingly aware, yes." "You're aware that I've opened an official investigation?" "That's less great." "You're aware that the Runaki delegation believes this is either theft or a calculated insult to their presence on this station?" Ben's stomach dropped through the floor and continued falling through several decks. "They think what?" Tina pulled up her datapad, showing him the official complaint that had been filed that morning. The Ulmara administrator, Mungodo, had escalated the helmet disappearances to a formal security matter, suggesting possible sabotage or cultural antagonism. The language was bureaucratic, but the implications were clear. Someone was messing with Runaki property, and the slug-like Ulmara took protocol violations with the seriousness of a religious calling. "This could shut down the station," Tina said quietly. "If the Runaki delegation believes they're being targeted, they'll withdraw. The Ulmara will demand investigations that take months. The whole joint operation falls apart." "Because I taught Cubs fetch." "Because you taught Cubs fetch." Ben looked down at the three cubs, who were now playing with each other, completely unaware that they'd accidentally triggered an interstellar incident. Rala was trying to climb on Mikto's back. Tisk was chasing his own tail, which Ben hadn't realized Runaki had. "I have to tell Commander Greml," Ben said. "That's one option." "What's the other option?" "You could return the helmet. I could close the investigation citing equipment misplacement, and you never teach alien cubs human games ever again." It was the sensible option, the safe option, the option that wouldn't result in Ben explaining to an 8-foot-tall warrior matriarch why he'd corrupted her children with Earth games. "Deal," Ben said. That's when Rala trotted over and dropped a datapad at his feet. Not just any datapad. The datapad belonging to Mungodo himself, complete with official Ulmara government seals. Tina looked at the datapad. She looked at Ben. She looked at the cubs. "I'm going to need you to come with me," she said. "And bring the cubs. We need to have a conversation with Commander Greml." "Can I pray first?" "No." The walk to Commander Greml's office felt like a death march, if death marches included 3 enthusiastic alien cubs who kept trying to play with every reflective surface they passed. Mikto had become particularly fascinated with his own reflection in the polished corridor walls, chittering at himself with the kind of existential confusion usually reserved for philosophy students. "Stop touching things," Ben hissed, gently pulling Tisk away from a wall panel he'd decided was the perfect climbing surface. "We're already in enough trouble." "You're in trouble," Tina corrected, her hand resting on her security datapad like it was a weapon she might need to deploy at any moment. "I'm just the person who has to document your terrible decisions for posterity." "That's weirdly comforting, actually." "It shouldn't be." They reached the commander's office, which was less an office and more a testament to Runaki efficiency meets intimidation. The door was twice the height of a standard human entrance, made from some dark metal that seemed to absorb light and hope in equal measure. Tina pressed the access chime, and they waited in the kind of silence that makes people reconsider all their life choices. The door opened, revealing Commander Greml in all her terrifying glory. She stood nearly 8 feet tall, her 4 arms currently occupied with various datapads and what appeared to be a traditional Runaki meditation sphere. Her fur was a deep midnight blue, shot through with silver that caught the light like starlight on water. Her fronds, the delicate sensory organs that framed her face, were currently at neutral position, which Ben's training suggested meant she was in professional mode rather than about to end someone's existence mode. Small mercies. "Security Officer Tina," Greml said, her voice carrying harmonics that made human vocal cords seem pathetically limited, "I was not expecting a visit. And you bring maintenance specialist Ben, along with my offspring." The cubs immediately swarmed their mother, chittering excitedly and climbing up her legs with the casual disregard for dignity that only children could achieve. Greml's fronds softened, a gesture Ben recognized as affection, and she gently detached Rala from her left hip. "Commander," Tina began, and Ben could hear the careful diplomacy in her voice, the tone that said she was about to deliver news that nobody wanted to hear. "We need to discuss the missing equipment situation." "Ah, yes. The helmets," Greml said, settling into her chair, which was designed for her physiology and made her look like some ancient queen holding court. The cubs distributed themselves around her feet, somehow sensing that playtime was over. Administrator Mungodo has been quite vocal about this matter. He believes it reflects poorly on station security. "About that," Tina said, then looked at Ben with an expression that clearly communicated, "Your mess, your explanation." Ben stepped forward, clutching Mungodo's datapad like it was a shield that might protect him from consequences. "Commander, I need to confess something. The missing helmets, and apparently this datapad, they're not missing because of theft or sabotage. They're missing because your cubs have been, collecting them." Greml's fronds went completely still, which Ben's training had mentioned was either deep thought or the calm before someone got thrown out an airlock. "Collecting them," she repeated slowly. "Yes, ma'am, because I might have accidentally taught them to play fetch." The silence that followed was so profound that Ben could hear his own heartbeat trying to escape through his ears. "Fetch," Greml said. "It's a human game where you throw something and someone brings it back and you throw it again, and it's actually really stupid now that I'm explaining it out loud." "I am familiar with the concept," Greml said, and Ben couldn't tell if her tone was angry or amused or planning his funeral arrangements. "What I am not understanding is how this led to my personal command helmet being removed from my private quarters." Mikto chittered something that sounded defensive. "He says they wanted to bring you the best toys," Ben translated, then realized he had no idea if that's what Mikto actually said or if he was projecting his own guilt onto alien vocalizations. Greml looked down at her cubs, then back at Ben, then at Tina, who was documenting everything with the enthusiasm of someone watching a slow-motion disaster. "How long has this been occurring?" the commander asked. 3 days, ma'am. They showed up yesterday with the first helmet, today with the second, and just now with the third, and the datapad. And you did not think to inform me that my offspring were engaging in unsupervised activities with station personnel? In my defense, I was mostly focused on the immediate panic and trying to return the helmets before anyone noticed. A strategy that clearly worked exceptionally well, Tina muttered. Before Ben could respond, Rala made a sound like a question being asked in a language composed entirely of music, and suddenly bolted from the room. Tisk followed immediately, because apparently solidarity among siblings transcended species boundaries. Should someone go after them?" Ben asked, watching the cubs disappear down the corridor with the speed of small furry rockets. "They will return," Greml said with the confidence of someone who'd been parenting interdimensional mischief machines for their entire childhood. "They always return when they believe they have accomplished something worthy of praise." "That's what I'm afraid of," Ben muttered. Tina's datapad chimed with an incoming message. She glanced at it, and her expression shifted from professional documentation mode to barely suppressed panic. "Commander, I'm receiving reports of, and I'm reading this verbatim, a violet blur removing tools from Engineering Bay 2. "That would be Rala," Greml said calmly. "She is the most efficient of my offspring when motivated. There's a second report of someone's lunch container going missing from the commissary. Tisk has always been food-motivated." Ben watched this exchange with the growing horror of someone realizing that his small mistake had evolved into something with its own momentum, possibly its own consciousness. and definitely its own agenda. Commander, I think they're collecting more things to bring back for the game. Obviously, Grethmal said, and now there was definitely amusement in her voice, which was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. My cubs are nothing, if not thorough in their pursuits. Grethmal stood, her full height making Ben acutely aware of exactly how small and fragile humans were compared to Runaki warriors. She moved around her desk with the grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime in combat, and Ben briefly wondered if his life insurance policy covered death by disappointed alien commander. Then she did something Ben didn't expect. She laughed. It wasn't a human laugh. It was the sound of wind chimes being shaken by a hurricane, of machinery finding harmony, of something ancient and alien finding genuine amusement in the absurdity of the universe. Mikto, still present, immediately perked up, his fronds rising in response to his mother's joy. "You taught my cubs fetch," Grethmal said, still laughing. "With station equipment, without permission, and they have been stealing items to present to you as gifts. When you say it like that, it sounds really bad." "It is really bad," Tina added helpfully. Grethmal's laughter subsided, but her fronds remained in the elevated position that suggested continued amusement. "Do you understand what you have done, Maintenance Specialist Ben? Violated approximately 12 station regulations and possibly started a diplomatic incident? You have engaged in bonding behavior with Runaki cubs," Grethmal said, and now her tone was serious, weighted with significance that Ben couldn't quite parse. "This is not a trivial matter among my people." Ben's stomach, which had been in a state of perpetual freefall since this conversation started, somehow managed to drop even further. Bonding behavior? The presentation of gifts? The seeking of approval? The return visits? These are how Runaki cubs choose their pod family, their extended kinship networks. It is sacred, Maintenance Specialist. It is not done lightly, and it is never done with outsiders. "Never?" Ben asked weakly. "Not in 6 generations," Grethmal confirmed. "Until now, apparently." Tina had stopped documenting and was now staring at Ben with an expression that suggested she'd just watched him accidentally stumble into galactic history. "I don't understand," Ben said. "Is this good or bad? Because I genuinely can't tell if I should be apologizing or congratulating myself, and I'd really like to know before I say something that gets me killed." Grethmal looked down at Mikto, who was now watching the conversation with the kind of interest that suggested he understood more than he let on. The cub still clutched the tennis ball from 2 days ago, apparently unwilling to part with his prize. "That," Grethmal said slowly, "depends entirely on whether you are willing to accept the responsibilities that come with such bonding." "What kind of responsibilities?" Ben asked, though part of him suspected he really didn't want to know the answer. "We will discuss this later," Grethmal said, her fronds settling into a neutral position that suggested the conversation was over, regardless of whether Ben felt it was resolved. "For now, return Administrator Mungodo's datapad. Tina, close your investigation and list the equipment disappearances as resolved misplacement. And Ben, meet me in Recreation Bay 3 tomorrow at the start of 2nd shift. We need to establish proper protocols for, how did you phrase it, fetch." Ben left the office in a daze, Tina walking beside him with the kind of shell-shocked expression that came from witnessing something unprecedented. "Did that just happen?" Ben asked. "You accidentally became alien family," Tina said. "Yes, that just happened." "Is that good?" "Ask me after whatever happens tomorrow in Recreation Bay 3. Behind them, they could hear chittering and the sound of small objects being dragged across metal floors. Rala and Tisk had returned, and from the sounds of it, they'd brought friends. Ben didn't sleep that night. He spent most of it staring at the ceiling of his quarters while Terence snored in the bunk across from him, blissfully unaware that his roommate had accidentally become part of an alien family unit through the power of recreational ball throwing. When morning came, or what passed for morning on a space station that operated on Galactic Standard Time and had no concept of sunrise, Ben dragged himself to Recreation Bay 3 with the enthusiasm of someone walking to their own execution. Commander Greml was already there, which was somehow worse than if she'd been late. She stood in the center of the bay, all four arms crossed in what Ben had learned was the Runaki equivalent of, "We need to have a serious conversation." The cubs were present too, sitting in a neat row like students waiting for class to begin, their fronds quivering with barely contained excitement. "Maintenance Specialist Ben," Greml said, and her formal tone made him want to apologize for everything he'd ever done wrong in his entire life. "We have much to discuss." "Yes, ma'am," Ben said, because what else could he say? "I'm really sorry about the helmets and the datapad, and teaching your cubs unauthorized games without permission." "Are you sorry for the bonding that resulted?" Ben paused, looking at the three cubs who were now watching him with those impossibly large eyes. Mikto still had the tennis ball. Rala's fronds were doing that flutter thing that meant happiness. Tisk was attempting to sit still and failing spectacularly. "No, ma'am," Ben admitted. "I'm not sorry about that part." Greml's fronds shifted into what Ben desperately hoped was approval. "Good, because among my people to reject a bonding once initiated is considered a profound insult. You would have made enemies not just of my cubs, but of my entire lineage. That's good to know, for future reference, when I'm considering teaching games to alien children." "You will not be teaching games to other alien children," Greml said firmly. "You will be teaching games to these alien children under proper supervision, with appropriate boundaries and cultural protocols." Ben's brain took a moment to process this. "Wait, you're saying I can keep playing with them?" "I am saying you must keep playing with them. The bond has been formed. To abandon it now would cause psychological harm to my offspring. They have chosen you as pod family, Ben. This is not a choice made lightly, nor one easily revoked." Before Ben could fully absorb the implications of becoming alien family, the door to the recreation bay opened with a hiss that made everyone turn. Tina stood in the doorway, and she wasn't alone. Behind her stood Administrator Mungodo, all 3 meters of slug-like bureaucratic authority, his skin shifting through colors that Ben's cultural training suggested meant either deep thought or digestive distress. "Commander Greml," Mungodo said, his voice carrying the wet, gurgling quality that made humans slightly uncomfortable. "I have received your report regarding the missing equipment. I must say, the explanation is irregular." "Irregular but accurate," Greml confirmed. "My cubs were collecting items as gifts for their newly bonded pod family member." Mungodo's eye stalks swiveled to focus on Ben, and Ben had never felt more examined in his entire life. "The Human Maintenance Specialist." "That's me," Ben said weakly. "The one who accidentally committed cultural bonding through the medium of fetch." "I am still missing my ceremonial sash," Mungodo said, and now his color shifted to something that definitely meant irritation. "It was taken from my quarters 2 days ago. I had assumed it was related to the helmet thefts." There was a long moment of silence, broken only by a guilty-sounding chitter from Tisk. "Tisk," Greml said, her voice dropping into a register that made Ben's bones vibrate. "Do you have Administrator Mongodo's ceremonial sash?" Tisk made a sound like a question mark trying to plead the Fifth Amendment, then slowly reached into the pouch that Runaki cubs had along their sides, used for carrying important items. He pulled out a length of shimmering fabric that was definitely, unmistakably, ceremonial in nature. "I'm going to die," Ben whispered. "This is how I die. Death by stolen ceremonial sash." But Mongodo, instead of exploding into bureaucratic fury, made a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could be produced by someone gargling expensive wine. "The cub took my sash for a human game called Fetch." "Yes, sir," Ben confirmed, accepting his fate. "This is the most ridiculous thing I have encountered in 30 cycles of administrative service," Mongodo said, taking the sash from Tisk with surprising gentleness. "And I once had to mediate a dispute between two species who went to war over the correct pronunciation of the number 8. He looked at Ben, his eye stalks conveying something that might have been amusement or might have been gas. It was genuinely hard to tell. "You have caused considerable chaos, Maintenance Specialist Ben. Equipment missing, investigations launched, diplomatic tensions raised, all because you could not resist throwing a ball for alien children." "When you put it like that, it sounds really irresponsible." "It was really irresponsible," Mongodo agreed. "However, it has also resolved a matter of some concern among the galactic community." Ben blinked. "I'm sorry. What?" Grethmal's fronds rose in what Ben now recognized as satisfaction. "The Runaki have been isolated in recent generations. We do not bond easily with other species. This has led to complications in diplomatic relations." "You're saying I accidentally improved interspecies relations by teaching cubs Fetch?" "Essentially, yes," Mongodo confirmed. "The fact that Runaki cubs have chosen to bond with a human is significant. It suggests a future of closer cooperation between our species. The Galactic Council will be interested in this development." Tina, who had been silently documenting everything, finally spoke up. "So, to be clear, Ben is not getting fired or expelled from the station for causing a diplomatic incident?" "Oh, he is absolutely getting reprimanded," Mongodo said cheerfully, which was a deeply unsettling combination of words and tone. "But he is also becoming a case study in accidental diplomacy. These things can coexist." The cubs, apparently bored with the adult conversation, had started playing with each other. Mikto still refused to surrender the tennis ball, which had now achieved the status of sacred artifact in his mind. Rala was attempting to climb the wall panels again. Tisk was investigating Mongodo's lower appendages with scientific curiosity. "So what happens now?" Ben asked, watching the cubs with a mixture of affection and lingering panic. "Now," Grethmal said, moving to the center of the recreation bay, "you learn proper Runaki bonding protocols. You learn how to interact with my cubs in ways that honor both human and Runaki traditions. And you accept the responsibilities that come with being pod family." "What kind of responsibilities?" "Teaching, primarily," Grethmal said. "Cubs learn through play. You have already taught them Fetch, which has proven problematic, but also valuable. You will teach them other things: human concepts, human games, human perspectives. In return, they will teach you Runaki ways." "I'm not qualified to teach anyone anything," Ben protested. "I'm a maintenance specialist who got this posting because I couldn't figure out what to do with my life." "You are qualified," Grethmal said firmly, "because my cubs have chosen you. That is the only qualification that matters in Runaki culture." Over the next 2 hours, Greml taught Ben the basics of Runaki bonding protocols. There were rituals, gestures, specific vocalizations that indicated familial connection. There were boundaries, too, things that were acceptable for pod family, but not for outsiders. Ben absorbed it all with the desperation of someone who'd accidentally stumbled into something important and didn't want to mess it up any further. The cubs participated enthusiastically, demonstrating various behaviors and correcting Ben when he got the gestures wrong. Mikto was patient, showing Ben how to properly acknowledge a gift-giving gesture. Rala was energetic, insisting on practicing the greeting ritual a dozen times until Ben got the timing right. Tisk was food-motivated, and Greml used this shamelessly to reinforce positive behaviors. By the end of the session, Ben felt like he'd completed a crash course in alien parenting, which was not something he'd expected to add to his resume. "One final matter," Greml said as the session concluded. "The formal bonding ceremony. It must be conducted within the next lunar cycle, according to Runaki tradition." "Ceremony?" Ben asked, because of course there was a ceremony. "A simple ritual. You will present gifts to the cubs, they will present gifts to you, and we will formalize the pod family connection in front of witnesses. It is, how do humans say it? No big deal." The way she said "no big deal" suggested it was actually a very big deal. "Who are the witnesses?" Ben asked cautiously. "The Runaki delegation, the station command staff, representatives from the Galactic Council, and anyone else who wishes to observe this historic moment of interspecies bonding." "So, everyone." "Essentially, yes." Ben looked at Tina, who was grinning with the kind of evil joy that came from watching someone else squirm. "You're enjoying this?" "Immensely," Tina confirmed. "I've already started the paperwork to add interspecies cultural ambassador to your official station role." "I'm a maintenance specialist." "You're a maintenance specialist who accidentally became alien family. You're going to need a bigger job title." 2 months later, Ben stood in Recreation Bay 3, which had been transformed into a ceremonial space that blended Runaki tradition with human practicality. The cubs sat before him, groomed and formal in a way that made them look almost dignified until Tisk tried to eat the ceremonial flowers. The bonding ceremony was, in Greml's words, simple. In reality, it was a 3-hour ritual that involved gift exchanges, traditional vocalizations, and a formal declaration of pod family bonds that Ben had practiced so many times he could recite it in his sleep. When it was over, and the formal part concluded, Greml handed Ben something wrapped in traditional Runaki cloth. "Your gift," she said simply. Ben unwrapped it to find 3 helmets. Not just any helmets. The 3 helmets that had started this entire mess, now modified with Runaki family crests and human maintenance insignias blended together. "For you and the cubs," Greml explained, "to wear during your training sessions, so that everyone knows you are pod family and that your activities are sanctioned and supervised." Ben felt something uncomfortable happening in the region of his chest, something warm and significant that he absolutely refused to examine too closely. "Thank you, Commander." "Thank you, Ben," Greml said, her fronds rising in the gesture that meant deep respect. "For seeing my cubs not as diplomatic complications, but as children who wanted to play." The cubs, finally released from ceremonial behavior, immediately swarmed Ben with the tennis ball that Mikto had guarded for 2 months like it was made of pure gold. "Again?" Ben asked, looking at the 3 eager faces. 3 enthusiastic chitters answered him. "All right," Ben said, taking the ball and moving to the designated play area that now had official safety protocols and proper supervision. "But we're using the approved toys only. No more helmets, no more data pads, and definitely no more ceremonial sashes. He threw the ball, and the Cubs launched after it with the same enthusiasm they'd shown that first day, when Ben had just been bored and they'd just been curious. Tina watched from the observation window, updating her security logs with the kind of detail that suggested future generations would read about this and shake their heads in disbelief. Terrence stood beside her, having finally emerged from his quarters to witness what his roommate had become. He taught alien cubs fetch and accidentally became a cultural ambassador, Terrence said. That's exactly what happened, Tina confirmed. That's the most Ben thing I've ever heard. Also accurate. Down in the Recreation Bay. Ben was teaching the Cubs the concept of gentle catch, which was proving more difficult than advanced quantum mechanics. Mikto kept trying to intercept throws meant for his siblings. Rala had decided that catching with her mouth was more efficient than using her hands. Tisk was just happy to be included. It was chaos. It was complicated. It was absolutely not what Ben had expected when he'd signed up for a maintenance position on a quiet research station. But watching the Cubs play, seeing Grethmal's fronds rise with pride, knowing that he'd accidentally stumbled into something meaningful, Ben couldn't bring himself to regret a single thrown ball. Even if the station was still missing 3 helmets. Well, technically they weren't missing anymore. They were just repurposed for interspecies cultural bonding, which sounded a lot better in the official reports than stolen by alien cubs who really, really liked fetch